So here's a fascinating question. Could a child's metabolism have a direct link to their behavior? Well, back in 2013, a really interesting study tried to get to the bottom of that. They looked at whether a very specific nutritional approach could help kids with autism who shared a particular metabolic profile. Let's dive in and break down exactly what they did, and more importantly, what they found.
Here's the game plan. We'll start with the science behind their whole approach. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the study itself, who was in it and what the treatment was. After that, we'll look at the behavioral changes, which are pretty remarkable, and explore this thing called the glutathione connection. And of course, we'll cover safety, limitations, and wrap up with some of the big questions this kind of research brings out.
Okay, so what was the big idea here? The researchers weren't just throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. They had a very specific theory. The idea was that for some kids with autism, a really important system in the body, the one that handles cellular cleanup, might not be running on all cylinders.
At the very center of their idea is this thing called oxidative stress. Honestly, the best way to picture it is to think about rust on a piece of metal. It's kind of like that, but happening inside our cells. It's this imbalance where the body just can't keep up with the cellular damage. And this study wanted to know, could this cellular rust be a major factor for some kids? And that leads us to the potential hero of the story, glutathione. You can think of it as the body's master cleanup crew. It's this super powerful antioxidant that goes around fighting that cellular rust and helps the body detoxify. The hunch was that this whole cleanup system might be struggling in some children with autism. All right, so with that theory as a launchpad, how did they actually set up this study? Let's get into the specifics of who was involved and what the treatment actually looked like. So the study ended up with 37 kids, and their average age was right around 5. But here's the absolute key. This was not a random group of kids. Nope. The researchers specifically picked children who, based on their blood work, already showed signs of that struggling cleanup system. They had issues with their glutathione and methylation pathways. Yeah, this selection process is everything when you're looking at the results. As you can see here, they started with 65 kids, but look, 17 were excluded from the get-go because their metabolism was normal. This was never meant to be a one-size-fits-all thing. A few more dropped out for other reasons, and they landed on that core group of 37 who fit the biological profile they wanted to study. So for 3 straight months, these kids got a 2-part treatment. First, injections of something called Methylcobalamin, which is a special form of vitamin B12. And second, they took a powder form of Folinic Acid, which is a type of folate. The whole goal was pretty straightforward. Just give the body the raw materials it might need to get that metabolic cleanup crew back online and working properly. So, the million-dollar question, did it work? Let's look at the results that really matter to families, the actual impact on everyday skills. Wow, if there is one number you take away from this entire explainer, it's this one. In just 3 months, the children gained on average 7.7 months in their adaptive skills. I mean, think about that. That's more than double the developmental progress you'd normally expect in that amount of time. And it gets even more amazing when you break it down. In just 3 months, these kids gained an entire year in play and leisure skills, on average. Almost a full year in coping skills. 10 months in personal skills, like, getting themselves dressed. Even their expressive language jumped forward by 6 months. This wasn't just a small change. It was a major acceleration. Okay, now this is where the story gets really compelling. The study didn't just find that behaviors got better. It found a potential reason why. This is where we link the biology right back to the behavior. The researchers themselves said it best. They found that the kids whose cleanup crew, their glutathione system, showed the biggest improvement were the very same kids who made the biggest leaps in communication, daily living skills, and social skills. This chart from the study really shows you what they're talking about. See all those dots? Each one is a child. The more a dot is to the right, the more their personal skills improved. The higher up a dot is, the more their glutathione levels improved. You can totally see the trend, right? It goes from the bottom left up to the top right. It's a pretty clear suggestion that as the biology got better, so did the behavior. Of course, we have to be balanced here. No treatment is ever completely without potential side effects, and no single study is ever the final word on anything. So it's super important we look at the safety data and the scientific context. So the good news is that for the vast majority, almost 3/4 of the kids, 72%, their parents reported no negative side effects whatsoever.
Now, for the 28% who did have some side effects, the most common one was hyperactivity. But, and this is a really important but, the study found that for most of those kids, the hyperactivity settled down once they lowered the dose of the folinic acid. A few others had some trouble with sleep or didn't love the injections.
Okay, now for some crucial context. We have to understand that this was an open-label study. What that means is that everyone involved, the parents, the researchers, they all knew the kids were getting the real treatment. There was no placebo group getting a fake treatment to compare against. And that's a big deal because it means we can't completely rule out the placebo effect, that powerful idea that sometimes people get better just because they expect to get better. So let's wrap all this up and try to answer some of the big questions that parents and caregivers might be thinking after hearing about a study like this. The first one is obviously the biggest. Is this a cure for autism?
And the answer from the study itself is a very clear, definite no. They're super specific about this. Yes, the kids made amazing gains, but their overall skill levels after the 3 months were still below the average for typically developing kids. It was a huge step forward, for sure, but it was not a cure. Okay, next question. Is this something that could work for any kid on the spectrum? And again, the answer here is not necessarily. Remember how they chose the participants? This wasn't for every child with autism. It was a targeted treatment for a very specific subgroup that had that particular metabolic profile. And that really drives home the point that autism is incredibly diverse, and a one-size-fits-all approach might not be the future. And that really leaves us with a final, powerful thought. By zeroing in on a biological subgroup, this study points toward a future of much more personalized support. It really pushes us to ask, how could understanding each child's unique biology completely change the way we approach autism support in the years to come? It's a pretty exciting question.